Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we're talking through the AQA GCSE History exam question guidance. We're looking specifically today at the 16-mark question. So the 16-mark question is 16 marks in total, plus 4 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. I wouldn't worry about the spag marks too much. They're pretty simple. As long as you're kind of spelling most words correctly, you can get 4 marks, and obviously we always want to aim for precise writing. So the 16-mark question is on 3 of the papers. It's on the Elizabeth paper, and obviously we know that that is the site study. It is on the migration paper, and it's also on the conflict and tension in Asia paper. So for this video, we're going to focus specifically on the conflict and tension in Asia question, and we're actually going to look at a question about Korea, and the question we're going to focus on is the causes of the Korean War. The question we'll look at today then is the division of Korea after the Second World War was the main cause of the Korean War. How far do you agree with this statement? So we've got a map here and we're looking at that then. We've got kind of the causes of the war, the events of the war and the end of the war. So thinking what are we focusing on in this specific question, it's obviously just the beginning of the war. So we're just really looking at these two events here, North Korea invading South Korea. A really important thing to do for a 16-mark question is to take the time to plan. I know it feels kind of counterproductive in the sense that you only have a limited amount of time to address and tackle this question, but planning actually helps you. Slowing down for a minute, understanding the question and planning what you want to say is not only going to help you with the spag marks in the sense of making your answer more coherent and clear, but it's also going to help you have deeper thinking and analysis. So what do you need to do for planning? The first thing is to rephrase the question. So for this question, as we've seen, you get a big statement and you have to try to work out what's the statement effectively asking you. What's the question within the statement? So for the question, the division of the Korea after the Second World War was the main cause for the Korean War. Your question there is, what caused the Korean War? If you had a question that said the main reason for opposition to the Vietnam War, or the main reason why the US lost the Vietnam War would be better, was because of the media, rephrasing the question, you would say, why did the US lose the Vietnam War? So just taking that time to make sure you've understood the question properly, and that way your answer can be focused, the sped, everything that you're using can be deliberate, and you'll just maximize those marks. The second thing that's quite important is obviously to continue with deciphering the question. It's about identifying the cause or the consequence or the factor that the question argues is the most important. Because once you've done that, you can ensure that you're writing your first paragraph really clearly about the factor that's in the question. The last thing you do in your planning is you make sure that you've really thought about it carefully and you're unlocking the sped and your deeper thinking by doing a short, small mind map. And that's where you decide another important factor. So you just take your time, you think, okay, this is what the question factor is. What's another factor? And you might end up thinking about 2 or 3, but you only want to write about 1. And the way that you can make that one factor that you're writing about extra focused is by thinking it through carefully first. The division of Korea after the Second World War was the main cause of the Korean War. Okay, so I can kind of see at the end here it's talking about cause of the Korean War. So the question is, what caused the Korean War? And the question's making a statement. So first we need to work out what cause is the question talking about. So the question's made a statement about what the main cause is, and that's what we do when we're thinking about causation. We try to prioritize and think which cause is better, and what point is this one making? Well, we can see it here. The division of Korea, that's the main point that it's making. So the division of Korea after the Second World War. Okay, so we've got here cause 1, the division of Korea. Okay, now, oh gosh, what were the other causes of the Korean War? Let's think back to that. So I like to think, okay, so we've got the division of Korea, that's the one that we've got there. We know a little bit about that. So, oh yeah, 38th parallel. It was also done because obviously Japan had occupied it. And after the Second World War, it was divided in two. And we had obviously North Korea and we had South Korea. North Korea was, of course, communist, and they were obviously they were obviously friendly to the USSR. And then obviously after 1949, China. Then we had South Korea, which wasn't necessarily capitalist, but it was pro USA, and it had, I guess, a capitalist economy. So we can see it, right? Yeah, because division of Korea is quite important. If Korea wasn't divided, then there wouldn't have been a problem necessarily. So Korea is divided on the 38th parallel because Japan had occupied it during the Second World War. North Korea was communist, South Korea was pro-USA, and this, of course, was maybe an underlying factor. Oh, I like that causal word, underlying factor, because the division meant that people in the North wanted unification, but that unification had to be under communism. But it's still a bit of a weird reason for like so many countries to get involved. This could have been just a small civil war. Why did it escalate into the Korean War, right? This huge war where the US gets involved, Britain, and all these countries from the United Nations. So let's think about it. Cheeky little mind map. What were the causes of the Korean War? Okay, so we've got, let's just have a think. So other causes, and we're going to choose our favorite one. Other causes, we could say, oh gosh, the Cold War. That was definitely a cause, right? So the clash of ideas. We had competing ideologies. And with that, we had obviously the US was capitalist, and for them, they believed that that obviously capitalism and democracy was the superior system, and that the world would all be better off if they were governed under these ideas. And then on the other side, you had the USSR, who was communist. And again, they believed that communism was the answer to all problems and that the world would be better off if they were governed by communism, because they saw capitalism as the exploitation of the working classes. So we've got two ideas, but the issue was that both of these ideas were equally powerful to each other after the Second World War. So what we see here is a culture of or global phenomenon of fear and suspicion, and this idea that capitalism was trying to take over the world from the USSR, and then for the USSR, they felt that the Americans, the North Americans, were trying to take over the world as well. So a very clear division, competing ideas, and a battle for dominance around the world. So with this, we see ideas in the US such as containment theory, and we see things like the Truman Doctrine. And what does this mean? Well, it means that the US is committed to stopping the spread of communism. The spread of communism. Okay, so we can see that quite clearly. With the communist ideas, just like the US, they're committed to spreading their ideas, because the more countries that are in your sphere of influence, the kind of more security you have, because you've got countries around you that are kind of in line with you, but you've also obviously got more influence and more power as a result. Okay, well, Cold War does seem to be a pretty important factor. I mean, I guess there's also the UN. You might be more comfortable talking about that. What's the UN about? Okay, so we've got one cause is the Cold War. Another cause, actually I'm going to put that over here instead so there's a bit more space. Another cause we could talk about is the United Nations. So what's the United Nations got to do with anything? Effectively, obviously, when we think about what the United Nations was, it was formed after the Second World War, and its idea was to protect, its kind of first principle is to protect a country's right to rule itself. So to protect national self-determination. And obviously that was the aim of its predecessor, the League of Nations, and that totally failed because the Second World War happened, the Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and then obviously invaded Poland as well. So League of Nations kind of fell asleep at the wheel there. So United Nations are like, well, we're kind of like the League of Nations, but we're better and we're going to do a better job of it. So obviously they see this opportunity when North Korea invades South Korea, and they're saying, this is now our chance to shine. This is our chance to prove that we don't just sit around and talk about things, that we are fully committed to protecting a country's national self-determination, a country's right to rule itself. And effectively, this means that they're quite active in responding to North Korea invading South Korea, the tiny little country, small kind of peninsula off of China, and they're like, nope, we're going to go in and we're going to protect it. Now, there would be barriers to this, and that is the fact that we have the Security Council, and they effectively decide what happens if the UN does anything. And the Security Council has these kind of 5 permanent members. It's got Britain, it's got France, it's got the USA. And obviously we're thinking about them, Britain, France and the USA, they're going to be very pro-capitalist on the Cold War side of things. And then on the other side, you've got the USSR. So the USSR has the power to do something called veto. And what veto means is they can block the actions of the United Nations. Someone could put forward the resolution and say, we want to invade South Korea. We want to go to protect South Korea from the North Korean invasion. And the UN can try and put that forward, but the USSR was able just to effectively block it. So why didn't it block it in the Korean War? Why didn't it block it in 1949? Well, effectively, the reason was in 1949, you had the Chinese Communist Revolution. So China, a former ally of the USA, has now become communist. Not only is China a former ally, but if it's communist, it is under the USSR's sphere of influence. So this now includes China. It includes obviously Eastern Europe. We talked about that Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill and his fears of the USSR kind of taking over the world. So 1949, you have the Communist Revolution. So they're now under the USSR's sphere of influence, but also a huge population. So this is an absolute kind of triggering moment for the USA, because they're like, whoa, we were really scared about the spread of communism, and now our fears have been confirmed and China's communist, so we've really got to intervene at any opportunity we have to stop the spread of communism. So effectively, because China became communist in 1949, the USSR boycotted the United Nations because the United Nations would not accept China's communist government as a legitimate government. So they're like, well, we're not taking part in the United Nations anymore. We're boycotting you. So the USA is like, fantastic. I'm really glad you're boycotting us, because now you can't veto our decision. And as a result, this kind of started the Korean War. So was it the United Nations and then the USSR's boycott that came as a result? So we've got a couple of choices there, but we don't need to have 3 paragraphs, right? Or we don't need to have 3 causes, sorry. Let's kind of just choose our favourite cause and try to stick to that. So we could talk about, obviously we have to, in our first paragraph, has to be the question factor, which is the division of Korea. Boom, we're going to talk about that. We're going to explain how that becomes a problem. But we need to maybe, and this is why planning is so important, because we need to make sure we stick to one other cause in our next paragraph. Of course, the spread from the different causes comes into play there, and that's obviously going to be referenced, and it's still going to be quite important, but we're just going to make sure we're sticking to one cause. So what cause you want to go for is obviously up to you, but for the sake of this video, we're going to use the cause of the Cold War. So we're going to stick to the Cold War as our cause, and of course we're going to use the SPED that we've used talking about United Nations as well. But I think the fact that the Cold War was kind of in the background of all of this, and it was really kind of confirmed the fears of the USA that Russia was trying to expand. So let's kind of delve into that and think about how do we kind of plan and structure this argument. So we've gone through the planning there. So let's just remind ourselves about the stages to this question. So obviously the first thing you do, you rephrase it. What's the question asking you? It's asking you what caused the Korean War. And then of course you've identified the question factor. The question factor is saying the division of Korea after the Second World War. And now after our mind mapping and our thinking it through, we've decided on our other factor. So another factor that we can focus on is the Cold War. And then once you've kind of decided your factors, we've now got our clear idea of where the essay is going. We also need to think about our conclusion, and that's where we get our top marks. The conclusion is where we're linking all of these things together. So what caused the Korean War? It was the division of Korea after the Second World War and the Cold War. But of course, we need to make an argument and decide which one's more important, and that's the conclusion. It's where you connect the causes and you show relative importance. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. Now that we've planned our answer, we need to think about what should the answer look like. How do you actually structure a 16-mark question? And it's actually not too bad. It's just 3 paragraphs. So effectively for paragraph 1, you're going to explain how important the factor in the question was. The reason why the factor in the question has to be the first paragraph is just in case you're running out of time. You won't get marks if you don't actually mention the factor in the question. So it's really important that we start with that. That way we've covered those bases. The second paragraph is where we explain how important the other factor that we've chosen was. So the other factor that we've chosen for this essay, for example, is the Cold War, and that's where we're going to write our second paragraph all about the Cold War. Once we've done that, in order to get from 12 marks all the way up to 16, we're going to make sure we write a good conclusion. So the conclusion is where you explain which factor you think is most important and you justify why. But what's quite crucial for this is you don't just justify, yes, this is the most important because. You say this is the most important because, and it's better than the other factor that I've mentioned because of this. So it's talking about relative importance, explaining why it's more important than the other factor. When we're thinking about our main body paragraphs, that's paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, a structure that we recommend is using the AEEJ structure. And that's only just because it's encouraging you to think carefully about the purpose of your writing. It's never going to look exactly like this, but it's just a very good thing to have in mind. So you start your paragraph with the argument, and the argument is where you're addressing the question. Then you have to prove your point. You can't just make an argument, you need to evidence it. So you evidence that and you validate the argument using SPED, talking about statistics, talking about people, talking about events, talking about dates. And then you can't just drop the SPED and leave. You have to make sure you explain how does the evidence that you've chosen, the SPED that you've provided, prove the argument. And once you've done that, you do your judgment. The judgment just affirms the argument. So let's say in your argument you use a causal word, which is really great for maximizing marks, and you say that this was the fundamental cause for something. In the judgment is when you justify that fundamental cause. You've made your case, you just link it back and tie it back to the argument. And for this 16-mark question, you just do that twice effectively. So let's see how this looks in practice. Okay, so we've got our paragraph 1, paragraph 2, and our conclusion. What we'll do is we'll go through and talk through a first paragraph with you now, and then you can write the second paragraph on your own, and then we've got some ideas for how to structure a conclusion too. So let's start then. So the question, the division of Korea after the Second World War was the main cause of the Korean War. We've planned our answer, now let's get writing. We're going to use our AEEJ structure, and I've colour-coded it here just so that we can think about how we would colour-code it ourselves. Okay, so let's start off with our argument. The division of Korea after the Second World War was an underlying factor which led to the Korean War, as without Korea being divided, there would have been no motivation for North Korea to invade South. So I've made a very clear argument here. I've even used a causal word to make my argument extra strong, making a case about where this sits within the causal argument. So of course we've made an argument, we can't just make an argument and not prove it, so we're going to validate that argument using evidence. So what I've put here is North and South Korea were divided along the 38th parallel, with North Korea being liberated by the Japanese, by Russian soldiers, and South Korea being liberated by US soldiers. So quite crucially there, I'm being really specific with my knowledge. Not only am I mentioning something quite detailed like the 38th parallel, but I'm also talking about who liberated each part of Korea. So that definitely counts as quite specific evidence. But now that I've put some evidence in, I should probably explain how this could lead to a cause in the Korean War. So here I've written, this meant that Korea was not only divided geographically, but politically too, as North Korea was communist and South Korea was anti-communist and pro-US. Now I think this is fine, but I'm not quite satisfied. I feel like I've made a good case for why it was divided, how this could be a problem, but I don't think I've made enough of a case for why this could lead to the invasion, and I don't think I've not even mentioned the invasion, so I probably need to do a little bit more work around this. So let me add maybe a bit more sped. So North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, as the leader Kim Il-sung wanted Korea to be united under communist rule, and he was fearful that South Korea might invade North. He was encouraged by China and the USSR, who provided him with military equipment. Within 4 months, North Korea had conquered almost all of South Korea. And I think that does work a little bit better. I think it works better because I'm being a bit, again, it's quite specific with it, and I'm kind of connecting the bit about the division and how this division led to war. So I need to obviously explain how it leads to war then, don't I? Because I've given just the sped so far. So this shows that a reason for the Korean War was the motivation of both South and North Korea to be a unified country. Fear of the other side invading encouraged North Korea to invade South in order to protect their national self-determination. I think that's much better. I think that's a lot clearer in terms of how this led to war, and I think it links and connects the sped nicely. So now I need to kind of really bring it back and tie it all together with a nice judgment. The division of Korea was therefore an underlying factor in the causes of the Korean War. Although it would not have been enough on its own to cause a war, if not for the wider global political tensions, Korea would not have been divided in the first place. Okay, so I'm making that nice clear judgment. I'm linking it back to the question, and there's a lot of clarity in my argument. Now you'll notice that I've actually not quite done A, E, E, J quite the same as you might have thought, in the sense that I've got argument, I've got evidence, and I've explained. Then I've got evidence and I've got explanation, and then I've gone to judgment. And that's okay. Like, you might end up doing that yourself too. It might just flow better. So A, E, E, J is something to just keep our minds focused on what an answer should look like, but it's not too prescriptive in that sense, but just making sure that we've got all of those things in our argument. So now I guess it's over to you. So it's your time to write your own paragraph, and then just to kind of, once you finish it, highlight it. Do you have argument, evidence, explanation, judgment, making sure that all of those 4 things are present. So for this paragraph, you're going to write a paragraph where you're explaining how important the other factor was. So in the plan, I suggested doing one on the Cold War, which you're more than welcome to do. If you'd rather do one on the UN, that's absolutely fine too. So make sure that you're just practicing that answer. You're more than welcome to give it to us to mark, and then we can kind of give you some feedback on that too. And of course, because we're all aiming for 16 out of 16, it's time to do the conclusion. So the conclusion is when you explain which cause you think is most important, and you really explain why it's more important than the other cause. So here are some sentence starters to help you. So ultimately, the main cause of the Korean War was, you choose whichever cause you think was most important. Then you say this was more important than the cause that you think was less important, because, and you go into that and you explain it. So by the way that I wrote the first paragraph, I think it's pretty clear that I don't think the division of Korea was enough on its own. I actually believe without the Cold War, the Korean War would never have happened. So I would probably write my conclusion. Ultimately, the main cause of the Korean War was the Cold War. This was more important than the division of Korea because without the global tensions and this battle for dominance in the world to have the greatest spheres of influence, Korea would never have been divided into two in the first place. The reason it was divided into two was due to this kind of conflict between the USSR and the USA. And effectively, what ended up happening was these tensions between these two countries, instead of being played out between themselves due to mutually assured destruction, it was played out on through proxy wars such as the Korean War. Now that's obviously just a rough way that I've said that, I've just thought out loud and said it, but effectively that's what you really should do, just kind of tying it together and making that case for why it was more important than the other factor. So hopefully these steps have been quite helpful to you. Just remember that you plan and then you write. And this 16-mark question is the same on all three papers. It's quite a nice, straightforward one, I believe. For the migration one, you'll be looking at factors. So it could be something like war was the main factor in encouraging migration to and from Britain. How far do you agree? Or something like that. And we will do a video looking at that question in particular as well.